Welcome back, brave souls. On a chilly autumn morning in 1963, a solitary figure arrived in Riverton, a remote settlement tucked into the mountains of Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Dr. Lysander Hargrave, a meticulous geologist with a reputation for brilliance and obsession with detail, stepped off the rattling train carrying only a leather satchel, surveying instruments, and a research grant from the National Speleological Society. His mission seemed straightforward: to explore the hidden cave systems beneath Seneca rocks. But what awaited him beneath the mountain would alter everything he and the world thought possible. Hargrave's arrival stirred cautious curiosity among locals. He was quiet, polite, and almost unnervingly precise. His lodgings at Mrs. Fenwick's modest boarding house became a base of operations. She later noted how he paid his rent promptly, requested no special services, and kept odd hours, sometimes vanishing into the night for hours, leaving behind only faint echoes of movement and the scratching of his pencil. To the casual observer, he was simply an eccentric researcher, but beneath the surface, his focus bordered on obsession. Almost immediately, the cave he intended to study, Whispering Hollow, showed signs that it was no ordinary geological formation. Hargrave noticed subtle irregularities in the rock walls and acoustic anomalies that distorted even the faintest sounds. He spent hours mapping the entrance, analyzing airflow, and documenting formations that seemed deliberately altered by unknown hands. These early observations hinted at human activity long before modern memory, a discovery that would drive him deeper into the mountain and eventually away from the life he once knew. Evening visits to the boarding house began to reveal subtle changes. Hargrave returned from his expeditions damp and chilled, sometimes disheveled, consuming guisses, usually large meals, in silence. Mrs. Fenwick recorded his behavior meticulously, noticing scratches on his hands, worn clothing, and an intensity in his eyes that suggested he had seen something extraordinary. He asked repeatedly about sounds in the house during his absences, as if expecting an answer that might never come. Local folklore only deepened the mystery. Hargrave interviewed older residents, learning of warnings passed down through generations, stories of Whispering Hollow being a place to avoid, especially during winter. Livestock refused to graze near the cave, and families steered clear of its entrance, believing the hollow cursed or haunted. Hargrave meticulously documented these accounts, blending anthropology with geology, as if the mountain itself was whispering secrets only he could decipher. By the end of his first month, Hargrave's excursions stretched into multi-day stays within the cave system. He left detailed notes of chambers, tunnels, and unusual acoustic patterns. His observations suggested that the cave was not only structurally complex, but possibly modified by humans over centuries. The first telegrams to his university hinted at a discovery that went beyond science, an anomaly requiring secrecy and extended study. Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confirm the darkest chapters of American history. If you made it this far, you are not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? Next, we follow Dr. Hargrave deeper into Whispering Hollow, where the echoes of the mountain hint at secrets older and stranger than anyone could imagine. As November 1963 crept into the Appalachian Mountains, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's routine study of Whispering Hollow began to diverge from conventional geology. Early snow blanketed the ridges, and biting winds carried an eerie stillness through the forested valleys. Livestock shied away from fields near the cave, and locals whispered of strange occurrences in the hollow, tales that Hargrave carefully recorded with clinical precision. It became clear that the cave's secrets were not solely natural. Hargrave's notes from mid-November indicate a growing obsession with unusual structural anomalies deep within the tunnels. Stone surfaces appeared deliberately worked. Passages had been smoothed and reinforced in ways that no ordinary geological process could explain. Even the acoustics seemed unnatural. Ordinary sounds were reflected and amplified, creating whispers in the darkness that defied logic. To Hargrave, these echoes were not illusions, they were patterns, intentional and deliberate, hinting at unseen human influence. He began extending his time underground. What started as overnight stays to measure humidity and temperature evolved into multi-day immersions. Mrs. Fenwick, observing from her boarding house, noted alarming changes. He returned soaked and exhausted, clothing damp from condensation deep inside the cave. His meals grew hurried, taken alone, often wrapped to carry with him back into the tunnels. Scratches and minor injuries appeared on his hands and arms, likely from navigating narrow crawlways, yet he seemed driven by something more profound than mere research. Local history and oral tradition began feeding his curiosity. Interviews with elderly residents like Ephraim Dulamer revealed long-standing warnings. Never enter Whispering Hollow between the first snow and spring thaw. Livestock refused to graze near its entrance, and families avoided the hole. How entirely. These superstitions, passed down for generations, became essential clues for Hargrave. He began to suspect that the cave had been a sanctuary, an isolated refuge used by unknown individuals, perhaps for centuries. By November 18th, Hargrave had sent telegrams to academic institutions, seeking guidance on historical settlement patterns and records of religious or isolated groups that might have used caves for shelter or ritual purposes. Responses were limited, but they confirmed his growing suspicion. The hollow had been altered by humans, not in the distant past alone, but potentially in the recent months or years. His research was no longer purely scientific. It bordered on anthropological detective work. Hargrave's own demeanor reflected this transformation. His precise, orderly handwriting began to falter, entries grew fragmented, and obsessions with acoustic phenomena and human-made modifications took precedence over simple mapping. He meticulously documented every chamber, every unusual stone surface, every pattern of sound that hinted at deliberate design. It became apparent to anyone reading his notes later that he was no longer an outsider observing the cave. He was becoming part of its story. Before we descend further into the hollow and uncover the first encounters with its hidden occupants, remember, this journey is not for the faint of heart. The mountain whispers secrets few dare to hear, and as Hargrave discovered, some truths demand total commitment, sometimes at unimaginable cost. Next, we witness the first mysterious signs of life within the cave, and Dr. Hargrave begins to realize he is not alone in Whispering Hollow. By late November 1963, the hollow had begun revealing itself as more than a geological curiosity. Dr. Lysander Hargrave, once a methodical observer of limestone formations and underground water systems, now moved with the cautious curiosity of an explorer entering a world that had long resisted outsiders. The cave's shadows grew deeper, and its echoing corridors seemed almost alive, carrying sounds that mirrored human activity. Footsteps, faint scraping, whispers that vanished as quickly as they arrived. On a freezing evening, Thessaly Millwood, whose homestead sat near the cave entrance, reported seeing lights flicker within the hollow for 3 consecutive nights. Hargrave, intrigued, took careful note in his journals. These were not the small glimmers of a headlamp. They moved deliberately along specific corridors, patterns too regular to be accidental. The presence of light suggested recent human habitation, confirming what his interviews and observations had hinted. Someone, or a group, was living within the cave system. Hargrave's notebooks from this period grow noticeably erratic, his entries filled with careful sketches of chambers illuminated by the glimmers, detailed observations of airflow, and measurements of temperature fluctuations. He recorded improvised seating areas, depressions in the stone that suggested bedding, and even primitive waste channels that hinted at long-term habitation. Each discovery deepened his fascination and sense of purpose. The cave was no longer merely a scientific site. It was a living, breathing environment shaped by human hands over decades, or perhaps centuries. Despite the allure, the cave was treacherous. Passages narrowed to mere crawl spaces, drops lurked in unexpected chambers, and the winter air carried an unforgiving chill. Hargrave endured frostbitten fingers and scraped skin, returning each night to Mrs. Fenwick's bays. Ordinghouse exhausted, silent, and often visibly shivering. But the isolation of the hollow, combined with the signs of human presence, ignited a curiosity that overrode fear. He began leaving his own markers in the chambers, small etchings, subtle notes, to track unexplored paths and map potential shelters. Interviews with locals continued to guide him. Ephraim Dulamer and Thessaly Millwood both stressed the importance of caution. Their warnings were vague but insistent. The cave was sacred in its own way, a space historically avoided by families for generations. Hargrave's logical mind, trained in science, struggled to reconcile the folkloric warnings with the tangible evidence of recent occupation. And yet, he could not ignore the patterns, the consistent lighting, the organized spaces, the human echoes that suggested intentional use and planning. By the first week of December, Hargrave had effectively established a semi-permanent station deep within the cave. He carried in provisions, marked his routes, and meticulously documented every unusual feature. It was during these first extended periods underground that he began to sense a presence, never directly seen, but inferred from displaced objects, rearranged stones, and subtle signs of observation. The cave, once silent, was now responsive. Every step, every sound seemed acknowledged by unseen eyes. Before we proceed deeper into the labyrinthine hollow, understand this. Hargrave's discoveries marked the point of no return. The cave was no longer just a subject of study. It had become a domain that demanded respect, patience, and caution, and lurking within its depths were the first signs of those who had chosen it as their sanctuary. Next, we delve into Dr. Hargrave's first direct interactions with the hidden inhabitants, and the chilling reality of Whispering Hollow begins to unfold. And the first weeks of December 1963 brought an eerie new dimension to Dr. Lysander Hargrave's expedition. No longer was he simply documenting stone formations or mapping caverns. He had stumbled upon evidence of a hidden society living silently beneath the mountain. The flickering lights, the rearranged objects, and the subtle sounds had begun to coalesce into patterns that suggested deliberate observation. Hargrave understood. He was no longer alone in Whispering Hollow. The first direct encounter came unexpectedly. Deep within a narrow corridor, Hargrave noticed a series of handholds carved into the limestone, worn smooth from repeated use. Beneath them lay a small set of footprints, not his own, nor any animal tracks he could identify. His heart raced as he followed the trail, moving quietly, aware that any sudden sound might provoke a reaction. Around a bend, in a chamber barely wide enough to stand, he glimpsed movement, a shadow, fleeting, deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, inhabited the cave was aware of him. Hargrave retreated cautiously, documenting the encounter in his notebook with extraordinary care. His sketches included the footprints, the carved handholds, and even subtle marks on the walls that suggested signage or communication among inhabitants. He began theorizing about the nature of these cave dwellers. They were organized, intelligent, and highly skilled in remaining unseen. Over the next several nights, Hargrave observed repeated patterns of movement. Supplies disappeared or shifted in ways that suggested the inhabitants were monitoring him, not with hostility, but with calculated detachment. Communication at this stage was impossible. Hargrave attempted subtle signals, tapping stones in rhythmic patterns, leaving small notes, but received no direct response. Instead, the cave seemed to teach him patience, forcing him to interpret presence through shadows, echo, and the minute rearrangement of objects. The discovery challenged every assumption he had made about human behavior in isolation. These were not desperate hermits or criminals hiding from society. Their presence was purposeful, disciplined, and quietly self-sufficient. At the same time, the physical strain of extended underground life began to take its toll. Hargrave's journal entries from mid-December document frostbite, exhaustion, and persistent scratches on his hands and arms. Yet he pressed on, driven by an obsession to understand this subterranean community. He noted primitive living spaces carved into rock ledges, rudimentary bedding, and evidence of organized food storage. Each observation reinforced the idea that Whispering Hollow had been systematically adapted to sustain life for long periods, possibly decades. Returning intermittently to Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house, Hargrave spoke less and less, often skipping meals entirely. When he did eat, he appeared distracted, almost preoccupied with the hidden world beneath the mountain. Locals began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor, a haunted vigilance, a meticulous attention to every detail of the cave, and a quiet reverence for the hollow itself. He was no longer a visiting scientist. He had become a participant observer in a society whose rules he had yet to fully comprehend. By late December 1963, Hargrave faced a critical realization. Whispering Hollow was a living ecosystem of human ingenuity and secrecy. To survive and understand, he would have to adapt, not just to the physical environment, but to the social intricacies of a hidden community that had thrived without contact for generations. Next, we explore Hargrave's first tentative attempts at interaction and the subtle ways the underground society tested his presence, revealing the delicate balance of trust and observation that governed life within the Hollow. By the final days of December 1963, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's presence in Whispering Hollow had shifted from observation to cautious engagement. After weeks of tracking shadows, footprints, and subtle signs of life, he realized that the cave's inhabitants were not merely passive. They were aware, intelligent, and patient, watching him as much as he watched them. The Hollow had rules, and survival and understanding depended on respecting them. Hargrave's first deliberate attempt at communication was modest. He left a small bundle of food near one of the carved ledges, accompanied by a handwritten note in careful block letters. "I mean no harm. I seek only to observe and understand." Days passed without response, but he noticed changes. The food disappeared, neatly arranged elsewhere, and faint markings appeared on the cave walls, subtle indicators that someone had read his message. It was not direct communication, yet it confirmed his presence had been acknowledged. Over the next several nights, Hargrave refined his approach. He learned to move silently, to anticipate the echoing patterns of footsteps in the winding tunnels, and to interpret the faintest rearrangements of objects. Each action of the cave's occupants became a lesson in patience, discretion, and adaptability. Hargrave's notebooks from this period reveal a growing respect for the society he had stumbled upon. These were people who had chosen isolation, not out of fear or desperation, but as a deliberate lifestyle, a society governed by self-sufficiency, environmental awareness, and careful observation of human behavior. The first direct encounter occurred one frigid January evening. While exploring a previously uncharted chamber, Hargrave spotted a figure, partially obscured by shadows. He froze, holding his lantern low. The figure mirrored his movements, neither approaching nor retreating, observing him, as carefully as he observed it. Hargrave describes this moment in his notebook as simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing. He understood instinctively that any misstep could destroy the fragile trust he had begun to establish. In subsequent nights, small gestures gradually established an understanding. Hargrave began leaving supplies, notes, and maps in prearranged locations. The occupants responded by providing subtle clues about the cave's structure, safe passages, and hidden resources. Hargrave's fascination deepened as he realized that Whispering Hollow was more than a network of tunnels. It was a fully functioning microcosm, with living spaces, ventilation systems, and evidence of long-term planning. The society had adapted to the environment with remarkable skill, creating a delicate balance between secrecy and sustainability. These weeks marked a turning point. Hargrave's research shifted from pure geology to anthropology, sociology, and human behavior. His field notes reveal an obsession with the mechanics of isolation, the social codes governing the cave society, and the philosophical implications of voluntary withdrawal from mainstream life. He began to question his own existence outside the cave, the constraints of academia, and the nature of human community. By late January, Hargrave understood that he was no longer merely a visitor. Whispering Hollow was a living entity, and he was becoming part of it. Yet he remained cautious. Any premature attempt at full integration could disrupt the society he had come to study and respect. Patience, he realized, was the key to survival, and to unlocking the secrets that lay deep within the mountain. Next, we uncover Hargrave's gradual acceptance by the cave society and the first signs that his disappearance might not be accidental, but a conscious choice to join this hidden world. As February 1964 unfolded, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's role within Whispering Hollow began to evolve. His cautious gestures of communication had been met with subtle acceptance. The cave's occupants, who had observed his initial attempts with wary curiosity, now allowed him to explore more deeply. Hargrave documented this period meticulously, though his handwriting grew increasingly uneven, reflecting both the physical strain and psychological transformation that came with prolonged underground living. During the early weeks, Hargrave maintained a strict routine. He studied the cave's environmental systems, airflow, temperature gradients, and water sources, while mapping the intricate network of chambers and passages. Yet, he was acutely aware that every step he took, every note he left, was observed. The society had rules, often unwritten, and breaking them could mean expulsion from the fragile equilibrium that governed their existence. He describes this first stage as learning the rhythm of an invisible community, understanding that patience and silence were as essential as physical survival. Hargrave began noticing the remarkable ingenuity of the inhabitants. He observed primitive yet sophisticated modifications, stone-carved shelves, smooth pathways that reduced injury, and ingenious water channels that delivered fresh spring water to living areas. These were not the remnants of a transient camp, but the hallmarks of a society that had mastered long-term subterranean living. Each chamber appeared tailored for specific activities: sleeping, food storage, crafting, and study, indicating deliberate planning and a shared understanding among the occupants. The first direct interaction occurred in March, when Hargrave encountered a young inhabitant near one of the central chambers. The figure approached silently, offering a small bundle of preserved roots and dried meat. There was no exchange of words, but the gesture spoke volumes. Hargrave responded by leaving additional supplies and a carefully folded note, introducing himself as a researcher and observer who respected their autonomy. From that moment, a fragile trust began to form, built on gestures rather than dialogue, observation rather than instruction. Hargrave's field notebooks from this time reveal a profound philosophical shift. He reflected on the nature of society, questioning the assumptions of modern life, work, and hierarchy. He began to see the cave community not as fugitives from the world, but as pioneers of a different social order, one where cooperation, self-sufficiency, and respect for the environment replaced bureaucracy, profit, and enforced conformity. His entries oscillated between awe and envy as he contrasted his past life of institutional expectations with the autonomy he witnessed underground. By April 1964, Hargrave's presence in Whispering Hollow became normalized. The inhabitants allowed him deeper access to areas previously unseen, revealing intricate living spaces and carefully maintained infrastructure. His maps grew more detailed, and he began noting not only the physical structures, but the patterns of life, the routines, movements, and adaptations that allowed a small society to thrive without surface contact. The months of isolation and careful observation began to take their toll physically and mentally. Hargrave recorded his exhaustion, his changing perception of time, and the subtle psychological effects of living without sunlight. Yet, these hardships were tempered by the intellectual and emotional stimulation of engaging with a society so radically different from his own. He was no longer merely a researcher in the hollow. He was, slowly, becoming part of it. Next, we will explore the point where Hargrave's integration reaches a critical stage and his voluntary disappearance from the surface world begins to take shape. By mid-1964, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's connection to Whispering Hollow had transformed from cautious observer to an active participant in the cave's hidden society. What began as field research had evolved into immersion within a self-sufficient underground world, where human ingenuity replaced conventional societal structures. The cave, with its labyrinthine chambers and acoustic peculiarities, had become both his laboratory and his sanctuary. Hargrave's notebooks from this period reveal a mind in transition. He meticulously documented the infrastructure, ventilation channels, water filtration systems, and storage networks. But his notes increasingly reflected philosophical musings rather than purely scientific observations. He wrote of the cave's inhabitants with admiration, noting how they had organized life around shared responsibilities and mutual respect without formal hierarchies. Their autonomy contrasted sharply with the rigid expectations of the academic world he had left behind. Interactions with the underground community deepened. Hargrave began sharing knowledge, offering insights on geology, mapping, and environmental management. In turn, he learned survival skills, such as preserving food, maintaining heat during long winters, and navigating the cave's complex acoustic zones. These lessons were passed silently through gestures, demonstrations, and small, written exchanges. Words were rare, but understanding was clear. The invisible social contracts of Whispering Hollow were being imparted to him. Hargrave's physical condition reflected both adaptation and the rigors of subterranean life. By June, he had lost noticeable weight, his skin pale from lack of sunlight, yet his endurance had improved. He recorded the psychological effects in painstaking detail: altered sense of time, heightened awareness of sound, and occasional disorientation within the caves, echoing corridors. Yet he described an unusual clarity of thought, a focus sharpened by isolation, where every observation mattered and no distraction could intrude. A turning point occurred in July 1964. Hargrave discovered a deeper chamber, previously unknown to him, where the community had created an elaborate living space. Beds carved from stone, communal areas, and evidence of ongoing construction revealed a society thriving in total seclusion. He realized that these individuals had mastered long-term subterranean living far beyond his expectations. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he could remain in the cave permanently, leaving the surface world behind entirely. Hargrave's notes from this period show a growing internal conflict. While he felt loyalty to his research, curiosity, and professional obligations, he also sensed that remaining in the cave offered insights and experiences impossible to achieve in conventional life. He debated the ethical implications of disappearing voluntarily, but was drawn to the intellectual freedom and authenticity of cave society. Each day spent underground reinforced the idea that his work and his life could reach a new level of purpose if he fully integrated with this hidden world. By late summer, the decision crystallized. Hargrave began removing personal artifacts from his boarding house, carefully taking only essentials he could transport without raising suspicion. His letters to Mrs. Fenwick, previously sporadic, became sparse, cryptic, and then ceased altogether. He was no longer a visitor in Whispering Hollow. He was a participant, ready to embrace a life entirely outside societal norms. Next, we will uncover Hargrave's final steps in severing ties with the surface world and the moment his disappearance became permanent, reshaping both local memory and the scientific community's understanding of human autonomy. By late 1964, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had made a decision that would forever alter his place in history. His fascination with Whispering Hollow Cave had deepened into a commitment. He would leave the surface world behind entirely and become part of the underground community. The meticulous planning that characterized his research now extended to his disappearance. Every movement was calculated, every trace of his departure minimized. Hargrave's last nights in Riverton were quiet, almost ritualistic. Observers such as Mrs. Fenwick noted his calm demeanor, yet there was an air of finality in his actions. His boarding house room, once cluttered with maps, notebooks, and instruments, was gradually stripped of personal effects that could not be carried into the cave. Only his essential research materials were retained, enough to continue his work without drawing attention. He left behind no explanations for his neighbors or local authorities, only a brief, enigmatic note to Mrs. Fenwick. Research complete. Findings require different preservation methods. Do not follow. The night of his final departure, the local community remembers faint, irregular lights in the hills surrounding Whispering Hollow. These lights, observed through winter's early darkness, were subtle, more glimmers than fires, and suggested deliberate movement. According to Mrs. Fenwick's ledger and later interviews, the lights did not alarm anyone, but created an unsettling awareness that Hargrave had entered a space beyond ordinary reach. Within the cave, Hargrave's adaptation was immediate and methodical. He established a permanent living area, incorporating stone beds, air channels, and hidden storage spaces for food and equipment. His notebooks reveal careful observation of the cave's acoustic patterns, noting how sound could travel across chambers undetected. Every step, every modification was designed to ensure privacy and security while preserving the integrity of the underground network. Letters previously sent to Mrs. Fenwick indicate that Hargrave maintained a fragile connection with the outside world during the initial months. These communications, delivered by unknown means, assured her of his safety and well-being, but reinforced his permanent withdrawal. Hargrave described the inhabitants of Whispering Hollow as deliberate, rational individuals who had chosen seclusion for philosophical and practical reasons. They were not fleeing society in desperation. They had consciously rejected its constraints, creating a microcosm of autonomous living deep within the mountain. Physical and mental challenges abounded. Hargrave endured prolonged periods without sunlight, carefully rationed supplies, and the isolation that comes with absolute separation from society. Yet he recorded an unprecedented clarity of thought, attributing his insights to the environment's quietude and the absence of social pressures. He documented the cave's modifications with precision: ventilation systems that mimicked natural airflow, water management channels, and chambers designed for both work and rest. He even noted a subtle hierarchy within the community, determined not by authority, but by expertise and skill. By the end of 1964, Dr. Hargrave's disappearance was complete. To the outside world, he was missing, an unresolved case prompting federal, state, and local investigations. Inside Whispering Hollow, he had transitioned from observer to participant, living among a society that had existed unnoticed for decades. His transformation challenged conventional notions of duty, identity, and human adaptability. Next, we will explore how the cave community maintained secrecy while Hargrave integrated fully, revealing the complex social and environmental systems that allowed this undergrowth and society to endure undisturbed. The deeper Dr. Lysander Hargrave ventured into Whispering Hollow Cave, the more he realized he was not merely observing an abandoned geological formation. The cave system had long been shaped, not by natural forces alone, but by human hands. Carved handholds, smoothed passageways, and carefully constructed chambers spoke to generations of individuals who had lived entirely beneath the surface. What Hargrave discovered was a functioning underground society, organized and deliberate, yet invisible to the world above. Integration into this hidden community was gradual. Hargrave's notebooks from early 1965 describe initial encounters with cave inhabitants, fleeting silhouettes in low-lit chambers, whispers in passages that echoed across cavern walls, and glimpses of hands arranging supplies. The residents, cautious yet aware of his expertise, allowed him to observe before permitting deeper participation. Hargrave's scientific precision and methodical approach earned their tentative trust. They recognized in him someone capable of documenting and preserving the cave's modifications without drawing outside attention. The society operated according to rules that were subtle but strict. Individuals were assigned roles based on skill rather than seniority or social standing. Some managed water collection and filtration systems, others maintained ventilation channels and structural supports, while others specialized in mapping and documenting hidden chambers. Every activity was designed to sustain long-term habitation, prevent detection, and ensure environmental balance within the mountain. Hargrave meticulously recorded these systems, noting how ingenuity and necessity had merged over decades to create self-sufficient underground living spaces. Daily life in Whispering Hollow was unlike anything Hargrave had studied before. Natural light was scarce, but strategically placed. Openings allowed limited illumination. Fires were controlled and vented to avoid smoke accumulation, while acoustic properties of the chambers ensured that sound did not travel between critical areas. Hargrave marveled at the community's ability to regulate temperature and airflow naturally, without modern technology, relying solely on observation, experimentation, and careful engineering. The residents themselves were diverse in age and background. Some had lived underground for decades, while others had arrived more recently, drawn by the philosophy of isolation and self-determination. Hargrave's letters to Mrs. Fenwick suggest that he viewed them not as isolated eccentrics, but as pioneers of an alternative human existence. They prized autonomy, intellectual exploration, and practical skill over conventional social or material obligations. Conflict was minimal. Cooperation was central. Hargrave's role, he wrote, was both observer and participant, documenting a culture that might otherwise vanish without record. He also noted the psychological impact of this subterranean life. Isolation from the surface world demanded discipline, resilience, and acute awareness of one's surroundings. Yet the community cultivated balance through shared responsibilities, mutual respect, and the quiet satisfaction of living in harmony with their environment. Hargrave's own mental state, according to his notes, became clearer, more focused, and deeply attuned to both human and geological systems. By mid-1965, Dr. Hargrave had fully transitioned into this world. The line between researcher and resident blurred. He began contributing to structural modifications, mapping uncharted passages, and assisting with resource management. His presence enhanced the Society's operations while providing him with unprecedented access to knowledge no outsider had ever possessed. Next, we will uncover how Hargrave's extended stay revealed evidence of ancient cave use and hidden historical secrets, and why some of his most startling discoveries were never shared with the outside world. As Dr. Lysander Hargrave delved deeper into Whispering Hollow Cave, his careful observations began to reveal a history older than any living memory. Hidden chambers contained remnants of previous inhabitants, primitive tools, faded markings on walls, and crude sleeping platforms carved into the rock. It became clear that the cave system had served as a refuge for isolated communities for centuries, long before Hargrave had ever arrived. Each layer of human activity told a story of survival, secrecy, and adaptation in an unforgiving environment. Hargrave's meticulous notes describe his fascination with these artifacts. Hand-carved symbols on stone surfaces suggested ritual practices, though their precise meaning was lost to time. In one chamber, he discovered a series of small niches, each containing what appeared to be ceremonial objects, scraps of fabric, polished stones, and animal bones arranged with care. Though centuries old, these items had been preserved remarkably well, likely due to the cave's stable humidity and temperature. Hargrave realized that the cave's original occupants had understood the principles of environmental control long before modern science could explain them. The presence of these historical elements introduced an ethical dilemma for Hargrave. As a scientist, he understood the importance of documenting and preserving these findings, yet he also respected the underground community's strict rules against outside interference. He carefully photographed and sketched the artifacts, creating detailed maps that connected their locations with natural cave features. His records emphasized patterns of reuse and modification, suggesting that the cave's inhabitants had continuously adapted older structures to meet new needs. In addition to cultural artifacts, Hargrave uncovered evidence of long-term living strategies. He noted water collection systems, carved directly into limestone, channels designed to prevent flooding, and hidden food storage areas. Primitive yet ingenious, these systems allowed communities to remain hidden while sustaining themselves entirely underground. Hargrave documented how air circulation had been engineered to carry smoke away from living quarters, a feature that also allowed voices and footsteps to remain inaudible outside key areas, an acoustic sophistication that explained the cave's eerie, whispering phenomenon. His writings from late 1965 also reveal moments of personal reflection. Hargrave pondered the motivations of these historical cave dwellers. He speculated that extreme environmental conditions, combined with the desire for social autonomy, had driven generations to withdraw from surface society. The echoes of their lives resonated through the chambers, as though the cave itself were a repository of memory and human experience. Hargrave's role had shifted. He was no longer merely observing an underground society, but also bridging the past and present, preserving knowledge that might otherwise vanish entirely. By December of that year, Hargrave's integration into the community was complete. He was not just a visitor or researcher, he was an active participant in ongoing maintenance and adaptation of the cave system. Yet the deeper he went, the more he realized that parts of Whispering Hollow remained unexplored, hiding secrets even older and more enigmatic than anything he had documented. Next, we will explore the mysterious architectural features Hargrave discovered, evidence that the cave had been intentionally modified over centuries, and why these structures challenged conventional archaeological understanding. As Dr. Lysander Hargrave explored deeper into Whispering Hollow Cave, he began noticing features that no natural formation could explain. Carefully hewn walls, symmetrical passageways, and hidden alcoves suggested intentional architectural design. Unlike typical limestone caves shaped solely by erosion, these spaces bore the unmistakable mark of human ingenuity. Hargrave's sketches from early 1966 reveal corridors aligned with natural airflow patterns, secret rooms concealed behind false walls, and support structures that hinted at an advanced understanding of subterranean engineering. The scale of the modifications astonished him. Some chambers were large enough to house dozens of people, complete with ventilation shafts and water drainage systems. Others were smaller, almost claustrophobic, designed for secrecy or solitude. Hargrave documented interlocking passageways that allowed residents to move unseen from one area to another, indicating a sophisticated social structure that prioritized privacy and security. Every corner of the cave seemed purposeful, a silent testament to centuries of careful planning. Hargrave's notes suggest he was particularly intrigued by the craftsmanship evident in these spaces. Stone surfaces were polished, wooden supports were treated to prevent decay, and simple mechanical devices, levers, pulleys, and counterweights, hinted at an intimate knowledge of physics and material properties. These features were not crude attempts at survival. They reflected a community that had thrived underground for generations, continuously refining their environment. The complexity of these modifications led Hargrave to believe that the cave had functioned as a long-term settlement rather than a temporary refuge. Some structures hinted at communal organization. Large halls, circular in design, may have been used for gatherings or decision-making. Narrow corridors connected individual living spaces to shared areas, balancing privacy with social cohesion. Hargrave speculated that the underground society had developed its own cultural norms and rules encoded in the layout of the cave itself. Even lighting was meticulously planned, with strategically placed openings allowing sunlight or torchlight to reach essential areas while keeping others in shadow. Hargrave also observed evidence of expansion over time. Some newer chambers seem to have been carved into older spaces, creating layered designs that reflected the evolving needs of the community. Certain rooms were left intentionally unfinished, perhaps reserved for future generations. His records indicate a careful balance between innovation and preservation, a recognition that the cave's history was as valuable as its present utility. Yet despite the sophistication, Hargrave noted a deliberate effort to avoid detection from the surface. Entrances were hidden, passageways obscured, and acoustic features manipulated to prevent sound from traveling outward. It was a world designed for self-sufficiency, secrecy, and continuity. For Hargrave, these architectural marvels were not just scientific discoveries. They were evidence of an alternative human civilization, one that had quietly persisted beneath the Appalachian landscape for centuries. Next, we will uncover Hargrave's encounter with the cave's inhabitants in more depth, their customs, and how his relationship with them transformed both his research and personal philosophy. By early 1966, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had spent months exploring the twisting corridors of Whispering Hollow Cave. His sketches, journals, and detailed maps documented every geological feature and architectural modification, but nothing prepared him for his first encounter with the cave's residents. The meeting was unplanned. A fleeting shadow glimpsed around a bend, a whisper carried on the draft of an underground passage. Hargrave's heart raced. He realized the cave was not abandoned. The inhabitants were cautious, yet observant. Hargrave's notes described them as physically robust, with eyes adapted to the dim underground light, their movements precise and deliberate. Their clothing was practical, fashioned from animal hides, woven fabrics, and materials scavenged from both the cave and the surface. What struck him most was their attention to hygiene and health, a clear demonstration of long-term adaptation to subterranean life. They were not primitive survivors, but a society that had learned to thrive in an environment most humans would find hostile. Hargrave's initial attempts at communication were tentative. He used gestures, simple drawings, and eventually rudimentary language to convey peaceful intentions. Over time, a cautious trust developed. He observed communal rituals, shared meals, coordinated maintenance of living spaces, and gatherings where decisions were made collectively. Each member had defined responsibilities, and there was a deep understanding of the cave's ecosystem. Water conservation, waste management, and ventilation were all carefully managed. Hargrave noted that these practices had evolved over generations, forming a complex society entirely independent of surface civilization. What fascinated Hargrave most was their knowledge of the cave itself. They knew every hidden crevice, every unstable ledge, and every potential source of danger. Their intimate familiarity with the environment suggested centuries of occupation, and they taught him techniques for moving safely through treacherous areas, navigating narrow shafts, and conserving energy in the absence of natural light. Hargrave's respect for their expertise grew. he realized that scientific understanding alone could not replace the lived experience embedded in every tunnel and chamber. Despite their self-imposed isolation, Hargrave noticed cultural depth. Symbols on walls, storytelling practices, and music created with simple instruments revealed a rich oral tradition. These were not merely survivalists, they were a society that valued history, memory, and knowledge, preserving lessons for future generations. Hargrave began to see parallels between their society and ancient human civilizations adapted for subterranean life. As months passed, Hargrave integrated more fully into their routines, contributing his knowledge of geology and engineering while learning from their innovations in underground living. He documented everything meticulously, aware that his own role as an observer could forever change the understanding of human adaptability. Yet he remained acutely aware that his presence was tolerated only as long as he respected their boundaries, a delicate balance that would shape the remainder of his life in the cave. Next, we will explore Hargrave's growing philosophical transformation as living among the inhabitants reshaped his understanding of society, work, and human purpose. By mid-1966, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had fully entered a life few on the surface could imagine. Months of solitary exploration had given way to shared routines with the inhabitants of Whispering Hollow Cave. The cave was no longer simply a field site. It had become a microcosm of human existence, isolated yet astonishingly complex. Hargrave's journals from this period reveal an evolving mindset, a philosophical shift that would ultimately define his decision to remain underground permanently. In his entries, he reflected on the stark contrast between the cave society and surface civilization. On the surface, people pursued wealth, status, and comfort, often at the expense of meaningful work and connection to the natural world. In the cave, by contrast, survival and cooperation demanded tangible contributions, but these efforts were motivated by shared necessity rather than social expectation. Hargrave noted the absence of hierarchy. Leadership was situational, dependent on expertise rather than title. Each individual's skill, whether carpentry, water management, or storytelling, was recognized and respected. Hargrave's writing grew increasingly introspective. He questioned whether modern society's obsession with progress and accumulation had blinded humans to simpler truths about existence. The cave's inhabitants had developed a system that fostered self-reliance, intellectual curiosity, and ethical responsibility. Hargrave began to see these principles as a blueprint for a more authentic human life. His scientific training allowed him to appreciate the cave's structural ingenuity, but it was the community's philosophy that captured his imagination. Despite the isolation, he did not feel loneliness. The residents' rhythms, their rituals, and their dedication to collective well-being provided a sense of purpose far more profound than any academic achievement. Meals, storytelling, and shared labor became meditative acts, reinforcing both physical and mental resilience. Hargrave observed patterns in the community that mirrored natural cycles. Work followed light and temperature variations, seasonal resources were carefully managed, and social interaction was deliberately balanced with periods of solitude. By late 1966, Hargrave's notes reveal the culmination of his transformation. He no longer viewed his disappearance as a dereliction of duty. Instead, he framed it as a conscious evolution, a deliberate move toward genuine understanding of human existence outside societal constraints. He wrote of embracing what he termed environmental and intellectual autonomy, the freedom to live in accordance with observable realities rather than imposed expectations. The cave had become both classroom and sanctuary, offering lessons impossible to glean from conventional academic life. Yet even as he adopted this new way of life, Hargrave remained meticulous in documentation. His maps became more sophisticated, incorporating living quarters, ventilation systems, and resource channels. He maintained detailed observational notes, blending geological, anthropological, and philosophical insights. These records, he understood, would one day serve as a unique testament to the possibilities of human adaptability and the choices that define individual purpose. Next, we will examine Hargrave's deepening role within the underground community, his integration into their society, and the critical decisions that sealed his permanent departure from the surface world. By early 1967, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had moved beyond mere observation. He was no longer just a visitor documenting the cave's architecture and inhabitants. He had become a participant in the hidden society that had captured his imagination. His journals from this period depict a man fully immersed in a world few outsiders could ever comprehend. The transition was gradual, but the implications of his decision were profound. He would never return to the surface. Hargrave's notes describe the daily life of the cave residents in astonishing detail. Each morning began with careful maintenance of water channels and living spaces, ensuring that airflow, humidity, and sanitation were optimized. Unlike the chaotic systems of surface towns, these routines were designed for efficiency and sustainability. Hargrave observed that communal labor was voluntary but structured. No one forced another to contribute, yet social cohesion ensured that necessary work was completed. He marveled at the blend of individual autonomy and collective responsibility. Over the following months, Hargrave began to adopt the cave's practices, contributing his scientific expertise to enhance structural stability and resource management. He developed new methods for storing and preserving food in the underground environment, refined mapping techniques for deep, unexplored passages, and experimented with sound management to reduce echoes and maintain privacy. His days were filled with work that combined observation, invention, and adaptation, activities that were simultaneously intellectually stimulating and physically demanding. Socially, Hargrave integrated into the community's subtle hierarchy. Leadership was not formal, but he gained respect by sharing knowledge and demonstrating competence. He observed that decision-making was consensus-driven. Disputes were rare, and when they arose, they were resolved through reasoned discussion rather than authority. Hargrave wrote of experiencing a sense of belonging he had never felt on the surface. The residents, he noted, were highly disciplined yet free, individuals who had deliberately rejected conventional society to pursue a life aligned with personal values and survival principles. His reflections reveal the depth of his transformation. He recognized the surface world's obsession with prestige, bureaucracy, and material accumulation as barriers to genuine understanding and fulfillment. In contrast, the cave offered a laboratory of human behavior and resilience, a place where intellectual curiosity was inseparable from survival, and personal ethics were inseparable from practical necessity. Hargrave recorded a growing conviction that this hidden society represented a higher form of existence, one in which humans could live deliberately without unnecessary social constraints. By mid-1967, his decision to remain underground was fully realized. Hargrave destroyed or discarded personal documents and identifiers that tied him to his previous life, signaling a complete break from the surface world. Letters he sent to trusted individuals, including Mrs. Fenwick, conveyed reassurance that he was safe, healthy, and committed to a life that offered both freedom and purpose. Next, we will explore the challenges Hargrave faced in balancing survival with intellectual pursuit, and the ethical dilemmas of living within a hidden society that had chosen to remain entirely separate from the outside world. Life, deep within Whispering Hollow Cave, was not merely an escape from the surface world. It was a rigorous test of endurance, ingenuity, and ethical reflection. By late 1967, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had fully immersed himself in the underground society. But he soon realized that the freedoms of the hidden world came with relentless responsibilities. Food, water, and shelter, taken for granted above ground, required constant attention below, and every decision carried consequences for the entire community. Hargrave's daily routines were meticulously documented in his handwritten journals. Each morning, he checked the cave's water channels for blockages and contamination, adjusted ventilation shafts to regulate airflow, and inspected the living chambers for structural stability. The cave's architecture, though modified by generations of inhabitants, demanded constant maintenance. Any lapse could lead to flooding, collapses, or the rapid spoilage of stored supplies. Hargrave noted that the physical labor was taxing, often leaving him exhausted, yet he described it as invigorating, a stark contrast to the sedentary nature of university work he had left behind. Beyond the physical demands, Hargrave grappled with moral dilemmas unique to the underground community. The society's rules were unspoken, yet universally understood. Privacy was absolute, interference with another's space was forbidden, and survival depended on both self-reliance and cooperation. Hargrave struggled with decisions regarding his own role. Should he push for improvements in efficiency, potentially disrupting long-established routines? Could he share knowledge gained from his scientific background without compromising the group's delicate equilibrium? His journals reflect hours of introspection, weighing the benefits of innovation against the community's need for autonomy. Interestingly, Hargrave observed, that conflict was rare, but not non-existent. Minor disagreements over resource allocation or sleeping arrangements occurred, and he often served as a mediator, using logic rather than authority to resolve disputes. He came to admire the subtle social mechanisms that governed behavior in the cave, mechanisms built on respect, shared purpose, and mutual trust rather than coercion. These observations deepened his understanding of human nature, revealing a form of governance that relied entirely on voluntary adherence to ethical norms. Hargrave also noted the psychological effects of isolation. The absence of external societal pressures allowed residents to pursue personal interests without fear of judgment, but it also demanded self-discipline. Boredom or recklessness could endanger everyone. He wrote extensively about his own mental evolution, acknowledging moments of anxiety, doubt, and loneliness, yet ultimately celebrating the profound sense of autonomy and self-discovery the cave provided. By late 1967, Dr. Hargrave had effectively mastered the balance between survival, intellectual exploration, and ethical responsibility. His journals from this period show a man fully adapted to an extraordinary way of life, one in which conventional morality intertwined seamlessly with practical necessity. He had transformed from a curious scientist into a guardian and participant of a hidden society, living under rules both rigorous and liberating. Next, we will uncover how Hargrave documented the cave's most secretive chambers, revealing architectural innovations that suggested centuries of deliberate human adaptation and the startling implications for anthropological understanding. Deep within Whispering Hollow, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's fascination had shifted from survival to discovery. The cave was no longer merely a refuge. It was a complex architectural enigma, a silent record of human ingenuity hidden beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Hargrave's journals from early 1968 reveal his growing obsession with the structural modifications, noting that the cave's chambers and passages displayed purposeful design far beyond what any casual spelunker or natural formation could produce. Hargrave meticulously documented chambers that had been hollowed and smoothed, stair-like formations carved into rock faces, and strategic ventilation shafts that directed airflow to prevent condensation and maintain livable conditions. Water channels, he observed, had been engineered not only for drinking, but to carry waste away from living spaces, a remarkable feat of practical design. Each feature suggested generations of inhabitants had lived, worked, and survived in total secrecy, carefully shaping the cave environment to meet their needs without leaving a trace on the surface world. Of particular interest were the communal spaces, which Hargrave described as centers of intellectual and social activity. These areas were arranged to accommodate gatherings, teaching, and decision-making, suggesting that the underground community was far from primitive or chaotic. Hargrave's observations implied that the cave's occupants had developed their own system of governance, education, and resource management, entirely independent of society above. His fascination grew with evidence of advanced craftsmanship, smooth stonework, carvings resembling furniture, and carefully constructed alcoves for storage hinted at both practicality and aesthetic sensibility. Hargrave's sketches, still preserved in part in private collections, reveal a network of chambers that seem to prioritize privacy, safety, and efficiency, an intentional balance between individual autonomy and communal life. Yet the deeper Hargrave ventured, the more questions arose. Some chambers displayed markings and symbols whose meaning he could not decipher, suggesting a cultural or ritualistic component to the cave's design. He hypothesized that these spaces might have been used for ceremonial purposes, education, or even memory preservation, passed down through generations. The systematic organization indicated not just survival, but a philosophy embedded in architecture, a deliberate attempt to create a sustainable, self-contained society underground. The most startling discovery came in what Hargrave termed the inner sanctum, a chamber far beyond known passages, accessible only through narrow crawlways and steep climbs. Here, he found evidence of tools and supplies consistent with recent use, alongside detailed carvings of astronomical and geographical patterns. These artifacts suggested that the cave's inhabitants were not isolated in ignorance, but maintained sophisticated knowledge of the outside world and possibly navigation, agriculture, or natural cycles. Hargrave's notes convey a mixture of awe and caution. He recognized that these findings could reshape anthropological understanding, challenging assumptions about isolated human communities, survival strategies, and the capacity for complex social organization away from mainstream society. He wrote repeatedly about the ethical responsibility of observing without intruding, aware that the slightest disruption could alter the delicate balance maintained over decades or centuries. Next, we will explore Hargrave's attempts to communicate with the cave's occupants, the risks he faced in gaining their trust, and the philosophical transformations that followed from these extraordinary interactions. By mid-1968, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's perspective on Whispering Hollow Cave had shifted completely. The caves were no longer just a research site. They were a living, breathing society, hidden in the dark. After months of careful observation, he realized that the traces of human activity were far too systematic to ignore. The inner chambers, previously assumed abandoned, contained tools arranged in deliberate patterns, supplies replenished with uncanny precision, and markings indicating a schedule or communal coordination. The cave's inhabitants were aware of him, but perhaps wisely, had chosen not to confront him directly. Hargrave began experimenting with subtle attempts at communication. He left small messages carved on stone tablets in chambers he assumed the occupants would pass, sometimes accompanied by simple offerings of non-perishable food. His notes emphasized curiosity and respect. He explained his peaceful intentions and detailed the purpose of his research without revealing unnecessary information about the surface world. Over weeks, he observed responses, small rearrangements of objects, new markings near his messages, and occasionally subtle signs that someone had inspected the provisions. It was, in his words, a dialogue in shadows, conducted through silence and signs. Despite his caution, Hargrave faced psychological strain. Months of isolation in the cave, coupled with the eerie acoustic phenomena of Whispering Hollow, left him hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Even minor disturbances, the echo of dripping water or shifting rock, were magnified into unsettling illusions. Yet he persisted, driven by a combination of scientific rigor and an emerging fascination with the philosophy and structure of this hidden society. His journals from this period reveal not only detailed descriptions of the physical environment, but also contemplations on human autonomy, ethics, and the possibility of life deliberately separated from civilization. In time, the cave's occupants seemed to acknowledge his presence. Hargrave noted areas where supplies had been subtly moved to make space for him, and occasionally small handmade tools appeared near his messages. No direct contact occurred, but he interpreted these signs as an invitation to cautiously enter further chambers. The deeper he ventured, the more sophisticated the cave's interior became. Stonework polished to smoothness, concealed sleeping areas, and communal meeting spaces arranged with intentional symmetry. He began suspecting that the community had a governance system, a philosophy guiding their isolation, and a method for transmitting knowledge to new members without relying on the outside world. By late 1968, Hargrave's observations had begun to transform his worldview. The cave society represented a living experiment in human autonomy, environmental adaptation, and social cooperation devoid of external authority. He became acutely aware that the choices he made, every step deeper, every message left behind, would affect the trust he was slowly building. His fascination was tempered with ethical responsibility. Intrusion could be catastrophic, both for him and for the fragile equilibrium maintained over decades. The stage was set for the next critical development. Hargrave's first direct encounter with the cave's hidden society and the profound philosophical and personal transformations that followed as he integrated into their underground world. By early 1969, Dr. Lysander Hargrave's patience and caution had paid off. The subtle signals he had left in the cave had not gone unnoticed. One evening, deep within a chamber that he had meticulously mapped, he discovered a set of items arranged in a way that unmistakably communicated acknowledgement. A small bundle of provisions, a carved stone resembling a human hand, and faint etchings that mirrored his own symbols. For the first time, Hargrave understood that he had been observed, and that the inhabitants of Whispering Hollow were ready to establish contact, albeit indirectly. The first direct encounter, however, was unlike anything he had imagined. One evening, as he rested near a hidden alcove, he noticed movement at the edge of his torchlight. Shadows shifted along the walls, but no human figures were fully revealed. Hargrave described in his journals a moment of both fear and exhilaration, realizing he was witnessing beings entirely adapted to their subterranean home. No words were spoken. Instead, a series of carefully arranged objects, almost ritualistic in appearance, conveyed an invitation for him to approach deeper chambers at his own pace. Hargrave's entry into the hidden society was gradual. He learned to respect unspoken boundaries, leaving messages and observing responses rather than forcing interaction. Over weeks, he noticed that certain areas of the cave were deliberately off-limits, suggesting zones reserved for particular individuals or activities. The society demonstrated remarkable organizational skills. He observed ventilation shafts ingeniously carved to regulate airflow, primitive water filtration systems, and designated sleeping and communal areas that reflected both privacy and shared responsibility. Hargrave's meticulous documentation revealed that this was not a haphazard existence, but a community bound by practical and philosophical rules, possibly preserved over decades. Interaction also brought profound personal revelations. Hargrave realized that these individuals had deliberately chosen isolation not out of desperation or fear, but as a philosophical experiment in autonomy. Their lives were governed by principles emphasizing environmental sustainability, intellectual inquiry, and social cooperation without coercion. He marveled at their resourcefulness, tools handcrafted from rock and wood, efficient storage systems, and signs of shared knowledge passed through generations. Yet the psychological toll was intense. Spending extended periods in near darkness, constantly alert to subtle signs, and navigating the echoing labyrinth of Whispering Hollow tested his mental fortitude. He described feelings of disorientation and surreal detachment, where days blurred into nights and the boundaries between observation and participation became indistinct. Despite this, he maintained scientific rigor, meticulously recording maps, architectural modifications, and behavioral patterns of the society. By mid-1969, Hargrave's integration was underway. He had become a silent participant, observing, documenting, and slowly understanding the structure of this underground civilization. His writings began reflecting not only geological and architectural observations, but philosophical musings. What does it mean to live fully free? Can society function without imposed hierarchy? Are there forms of knowledge inaccessible on the surface that only exist in isolation? The next chapter would reveal Hargrave's decision to fully embrace life underground, abandoning the surface world entirely and transforming from a researcher into a permanent member of Whispering Hollow's hidden society. By late 1969, Dr. Lysander Hargrave had spent months navigating the shadowed corridors of Whispering Hollow Cave, a place where light was scarce and every echo seemed alive. What had begun as curiosity and scientific duty now evolved into a profound personal reckoning. Hargrave's journals reveal that the cave society was not merely surviving underground. They had thrived. Every chamber had a purpose, every passage a history, and the residents themselves exhibited a discipline and understanding that blurred the lines between human ingenuity and near-mystical adaptation. For Hargrave, the choice he faced was unprecedented. Returning to the surface meant abandoning the community he had begun to understand, a world structured entirely around autonomy, intelligence, and shared responsibility. The surface offered recognition, status, and the familiar comforts of academia, but it also demanded compromise, bureaucracy, and an existence bound by societal expectations. Hargrave wrestled with what he called the authentic question of human fulfillment. Could the true potential of mind and body ever be realized under conventional social constraints, or was isolation the only path to meaningful understanding? His decision crystallized one freezing winter evening. Within a chamber deeper than he had previously dared explore, he encountered the society's central communal space, a natural amphitheater carved into the limestone, illuminated by a series of small fire pits. The space was alive with the hum of activity, shadows moving with deliberate purpose, arrangements of stone and wood suggesting roles, tasks, and responsibilities, but without any hierarchy imposed from above. Hargrave felt a deep sense of belonging, tempered by awe. He recorded in his journals that the society's members seemed to exist in a rhythm aligned with the mountain itself, guided by environmental cues, collective memory, and mutual respect, rather than external authority. The final stage of Hargrave's transformation was deliberate and symbolic. He destroyed his university credentials, ensuring that no return to conventional life could be demanded. He left carefully prepared letters for Mrs. Fenwick, explaining that he remained safe but could not return. These communications expressed gratitude, explained his reasoning, and described the intellectual and emotional fulfillment he had found underground. In his words, the world above had become a distraction from the pursuit of genuine understanding. The letters conveyed a man who had not lost reason or sanity, but had embraced a form of existence that most could not comprehend. Hargrave's disappearance from the surface world was formalized with remarkable clarity. Federal and local authorities recorded his absence, yet the Cave Society's presence complicated any traditional search or investigation. By choosing permanent residence underground, Hargrave effectively became both a subject of folklore and a living testament to the possibility of human autonomy beyond societal frameworks. Even as surface observers speculated, Dr. Hargrave's life in Whispering Hollow entered a new rhythm. He participated in maintaining infrastructure, documenting changes, and observing the society's culture. His role shifted from outsider to participant, blending scientific inquiry with lived experience. Next, we will explore Section 20, revealing the long-term legacy of Dr. Hargrave's choice, the Cave Society's survival, and how this extraordinary story blurred the line between history, science, and legend. The final chapter of Dr. Lysander Hargrave's story is not merely about disappearance, it is about the consequences of choosing a life entirely outside society's gaze. By the mid-1970s, Whispering Hollow Cave had become more than a refuge. It was a fully functioning microcosm, a testament to human adaptability and the will to construct meaning in isolation. Hargrave, once a respected academic, had now transformed into an integral member of this hidden society, blending observation with participation, science with lived experience. The underground community itself continued to thrive quietly. Investigations by outsiders were rare, often halted when it became clear that the residents were determined to remain undisturbed. Evidence of recent habitation, fire pits, tools, and carefully mapped passageways persisted, suggesting a sustainable and organized existence. Hargrave's writings from this period, preserved only in private letters and notes, detail meticulous records of environmental modifications, social dynamics, and the philosophy underpinning the community's way of life. He observed that the group's success relied on mutual respect, self-sufficiency, and a shared understanding of environmental limits, principles starkly different from those enforced above ground. For the surface world, Dr. Hargrave's disappearance became a historical curiosity. Universities and scientific communities continued to reference his early research, citing his pioneering work in karst topography, cave mapping, and subterranean hydrology. Yet the true magnitude of his discovery, the existence of a deliberately hidden, organized society, remained unacknowledged in any official record. Local folklore absorbed fragments of his story, passing tales of lights in the cave and the mysterious scientist who vanished into the mountains from one generation to the next. Children grew up hearing these AC Suu, ounce as both entertainment and cautionary tale, a symbol of human mystery intertwined with the Appalachian wilderness. Hargrave's decision raises enduring philosophical and ethical questions. What does it mean to pursue knowledge freely, unbound by institutional or societal expectations? How should modern society respond when individuals choose self-imposed isolation over conventional responsibility? Whispering Hollow presents a rare instance where human ingenuity and autonomy were exercised to their fullest, challenging norms about work, obligation, and personal fulfillment. By 1980, Dr. Hargrave had become a near mythical figure, a living bridge between scientific rigor and human freedom. While official records treated him as missing or voluntarily absent, those who had glimpsed the cave's inner workings understood the profound implications of his choice. The Cave Society persisted, an underground testament to deliberate withdrawal, intellectual pursuit, and environmental mastery. Hargrave's legacy, therefore, is dual, academically, in the maps and research techniques he left behind, and philosophically in the demonstration of what human life could look like when freed from conventional constraints. Before we close this extraordinary journey, consider this. Whispering Hollow is not simply a cave, nor was Hargrave merely a missing researcher. Their story is a meditation on choice, curiosity, and the delicate balance between society and self. It reminds us that some truths exist beyond institutional control, and some discoveries demand that we step into the unknown to witness them fully. This concludes our exploration of Dr. Lysander Hargrave and Whispering Hollow Cave, a tale of mystery, courage, and an extraordinary journey into isolation.